You do
Yeah.
mention the '96 Bulls, which was, in my opinion, probably the most perfect team of all time. I mean, the reason is because they had the greatest offensive player. Well, one of the I think along with Wilt, Jordan is probably one of the top two best scorers of all time um, on their
Hmm.
team. They also had three of the best defensive players of all time: himself,
Hmm.
Scottie Pippen, and Dennis
Hmm.
Rodman. Uh,
Yep.
One thing you mentioned is the blocks and the steals don't really show the full extent of the player's abilities. I mean, just think about Rodman. He's one of the
Right.
greatest defenders of all time. He doesn't have that many blocks or steals, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And that's what it comes down to. If you watch those Chicago
Yeah.
Bulls teams, especially last three championships, they never had a dominant big man. And they didn't really block that many shots, but they played phenomenal defense. So defense isn't always just about getting the block shot or about getting the steals. It's about having an action plan, communicating like
Mm-hmm.
with your teammates in terms of helping each other out and just sticking with the action plan and good position defense, knowing when to help, knowing how to shut down your own guy, keeping your player in front of you all the time, challenging the shot, but you don't necessarily have to block it. So that's really what great defense is all about. And yeah,
Great.
and yeah, and defensively, really, this '96 Chicago Bulls team, all the Chicago Bulls teams defensively were maybe the greatest defensive teams I've ever seen. Those Chicago Bulls teams, all six championships,
Probably
were
the
the greatest defensive
2004
teams I've
Pistons
ever
come
seen.
pretty close. they were really,
Pretty
they're a really
close,
good defensive team too.
pretty
Yeah.
close. They were really, really good defensively. Yeah, they were really, really good. And I would say they're pretty close. But the difference you compare those two teams, well, one side's got
Yeah,
Jordan
I mean,
and
like,
they got a triangle
think about
offense
the
as
Bulls.
well.
Like, they had that
So
perfect offense, perfect defense. It's just the perfect team.
yeah. Well, that's a really good point. You made a really good point about the perfect offense, perfect defense, because it's not just about the defense. They had everything. Their defense was perfect. It was fundamentally sound, but their offense was
Yeah.
perfect too. They played the triangle offense, and that they just played the right way. The triangle offense is all about the triangle offense is actually an offense that's more similar to old school
Mm.
basketball, say back during the '60s or whatnot, when players had to move the ball around and play better team game on offense and pass the ball around. And that's what the triangle offense is all about. So they play such a smart game. Back during the '90s, I think the only two teams that I've noticed that really played the triangle, a form of the triangle, was the Chicago Bulls, and sometimes um, the Utah Jazz. Sometimes they played a lot of pick and roll,
Yeah.
but they also had some executions that were similar to triangle offense too for the
Mm.
Utah Jazz, and that's why both of these teams made the finals
Right.
back to back in '97 and '98, and that's also why when you saw those Chicago Bulls championship teams, like what you mentioned, great offense, great defense, their point differential was amazing during that time, really high point
Right.
differential. Well, hey, you know what? You give Jordan Hakeem Olajuwon, I mean, and it's game over
That's
pretty
the
much,
team.
right? Imagine
I
that.
mean, you saw what Jordan did with just
Yeah,
Pippen, right? Give him a Hakeem.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, exactly. But at the same time, like I always say, that Bulls team, Scottie Pippen was great. Michael Jordan's
Yeah.
great, obviously. But it's also the coaching staff as well. The way those classic Chicago Bulls teams played was robotic. You rarely see them make a mistake, either on defense or offense, for the entire game. Missing a shot's one thing. That's fine. But their decision making of what
Mm-hmm.
shots to take is just on point most of the time. And fundamentally, on both ends, their decision making on defense to offense is just really great. When to run a fast break, when to execute, when to play in the half court, what type of defense you're going to play against these
For
guys.
sure.
And that's really a sign of great coaching, really, really great coaching. Phil Jackson's obviously one of the best coaches of all time. But I think also it's Phil Jackson along with that Bulls coaching staff that was really special back in the day. For example, you had Tex Winters and you
Yep.
have Johnny Bach and these guys. Especially Johnny Bach was in the first three championships. And Johnny Bach was actually their defensive specialist back in the day. So the Bulls back then, they had something called the Doberman defense. And the Doberman defense was actually designed by
Mm.
Johnny Bach. And what that does was they pretty much use Scottie Pippen and Michael Jordan because these guys were really long, athletic wing players that covered so much ground and has such high basketball IQ that they actually pretty much designed this defense to have both Pippen and Jordan just kind of go all over the place, knowing when to double team, knowing when to help, knowing when to shut down their own guy, and they were just pretty much just destroying other teams defensively. And Tex Winters is pretty much your walking encyclopedia back in the day for basketball. And he was pretty much the guy who he didn't invent the triangle offense, but he polished it up and he brought it back. He's pretty much a walking encyclopedia of the triangle offense. And Phil Jackson's the guy who was a leader and he had the vision for all this as well. So that coaching staff was pretty
And
amazing. And then you got
they had the perfect role players back then. Horace Grant was underrated. I think people don't give Horace Grant as much credit.
Yeah.
He was a big part of that '94 Bulls team that didn't have Jordan. They still made it to the Eastern Conference Finals.
Yes.
Down to like
Horace Grant was a
like
really
down
good
to
player.
like one game or something.
Yeah.
Great role players. Tony Kukoc, John Paxson, Steve Kerr,
Ron Harper.
Yep.
Ron Harper as well. Harper was a really, really good defender during the last 3 championships for them. He was their big point guard, and he made so much difference.
Sure.
So many other players. Randy Brown, nice little spark plug. Judd Butchler, like you mentioned, Steve Kerr. And then their centers were Luke Longley, Bill Wennington in the last 3 championships. What made the Bulls really special, the first 3 championship Bulls and the second 3 championship Bulls were a little bit different. The second 3 championship Bulls had a big backcourt defensively because they had Ron Harper at point guard. And that helped them to better match up with teams like Orlando Magic's back in the day. Because Orlando Magic was one of the few NBA teams that had a really big backcourt with Nick Anderson, and you got Penny Hardaway, and you got Dennis Scott as well. These guys were all big and tall. And so when they actually got Ron Harper and persuaded him to play defense, be a defensive stopper, and then now you got him, you got Jordan, you got Pippen, and you got Rahman, who's kind of a hybrid defender. He's pretty mobile for a power forward. He's around 6'7", so he's kind of a hybrid defender as well. You have all these guys who are like long and lengthy, and they can just switch all the time on defense, and you're not losing any coverage at all. You're not giving up anything when you're switching with these guys because they're all roughly around the same length, and that made that last 3 championship team really special. But at the same time, Horace Grant was actually very special too, because the difference between the first 3 championship Chicago Bulls and the last 3 championship Chicago Bulls, a lot of it, if you actually watched them play back in the day, was defensively. Horace Grant actually, in my opinion, gave the first 3 championship team another dimension defensively. Reason being is because, number one, he was a slightly better shot blocker than Dennis Rodman was, but most importantly was because Rodman was an amazing player. In my opinion, Rodman might actually be one of the 2 greatest rebounders I've ever seen of all time.
It's insane.
But the thing was, but the thing about Rodman is great player, but he really, really cared about his rebounding stats sometimes. So when you watch the Bulls play defensively, the way they set up their defense, Rodman, you can tell he had a tendency. He didn't like to actually come out from the paint on defense to help out sometimes. He actually wanted to stay a little bit closer to the paint because he was worried about his rebounds. And the difference with that is that Horace Grant didn't care so much about the rebounds. So Horace Grant, with his athleticism and his length, he was actually kind of the kind of your free safety type of defender in the back. So what happens is the first 3 championships, you can actually have Jordan and Pippen doing a full court press against the other team on defense, and they're not worried because Horace Grant is willing to actually move away from the basket. He doesn't care about the rebounds, and he's willing to, just in case, say, for example, if the opposing team's point guard is being pressed by Jordan and Pippen in a double team in a full court press. If the point guard actually gets desperate and he actually makes a successful pass down the court, then you're at a disadvantage now because their team now has a 1 man up on you. But what happens is when Pippen and Jordan, when they're pressing back in the first 3 championships, Horace Grant doesn't mind coming out from the paint to try to intercept the long pass. So that's why it allows Pippen and Jordan back in the first 3 championships to actually play a lot more full court defense against the opposing teams and put so much pressure on them because they're not worried. They're like, we can just pressure these guys as much as we want because we know Horace Grant is at the back. In case they beat us, Horace Grant's at the back there trying to stop them or trying to pick off the actual the long pass down the court. But Rodman doesn't do that quite as much compared to Horace Grant. And that's why in the last 3 championships, if you watched, those Chicago Bulls teams, they didn't quite do the full court press quite as much as the first 3 championship teams. Right. However, the last 3 championship team was also special in their own way as well because they had more height in the backcourt with Ron Harper and along with Michael Jordan. And then that also gave them another different type of advantage as well. So yeah, give and take. Both teams are great, just
Well,
different.
it's a lot of insight to those Bulls teams. Cool.